Sometimes the people closest to us are hiding in plain sight, and the most extraordinary love stories unfold in the most ordinary places. David Moore thought he knew exactly who he was working for when he took that third job, just another demanding boss at a small accounting firm. Someone who expected perfection and rarely offered praise. For 2 years, he scrubbed floors after midnight, delivered packages at dawn, and balanced spreadsheets in between, all to keep food on the table for his twin daughters after their mother walked away. He had no idea that the stern woman reviewing his work every evening had been watching him with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd been searching for him for years. What started as a desperate father's survival plan turned into the most shocking family reunion imaginable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry at 4:15 a.m. had become as familiar to David Moore as his own heartbeat, a sound that meant another 18-hour marathon was about to begin. In the pre-dawn darkness of his cramped apartment in Millfield, a small industrial town nestled between rolling hills and forgotten factories, David's feet hit the cold linoleum floor with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to make every second count. 3 jobs. That's what it took to keep his 8-year-old twin daughters fed, housed, and in clean clothes. 3 jobs to fill the void left when their mother, Jessica, had walked out 18 months ago with nothing but a suitcase and a note saying she couldn't handle this life anymore. 3 jobs to prove to himself and to anyone watching that he wouldn't let his girls down the way he'd been let down as a boy. David moved through his morning routine like a choreographed dance. Coffee first, black and strong enough to wake the dead. Then a quick check on Megan and Melissa, still curled together in the single bed they shared. Their dark hair spread across pillows that had seen better days, but were clean and soft because David made sure of that. Their faces in sleep carried the same peaceful expression they'd had as babies, before life had taught them that Daddy had to leave, before they woke up and wouldn't return until long after they'd fallen asleep. The first job started at 5 a.m. sharp. Bayside Cleaning Services wasn't glamorous work. David spent his mornings scrubbing floors at the downtown medical complex, emptying trash bins and sanitizing surfaces that most people never noticed. But it was honest work that paid $12 an hour, and Mrs. Patterson, the supervisor, didn't ask questions about his other obligations. She'd even let him bring the girls on school holidays, setting them up in the break room with coloring books while he worked nearby hallways. By 9 a.m., David had traded his cleaning uniform for delivery gear. Morrison's Package Express paid better $15 an hour plus gas money, but it meant driving his aging Honda Civic across 3 counties, delivering everything from legal documents to birthday presents to people who had the luxury of scheduling their lives around convenience rather than necessity. The car burned oil and the air conditioning had died last summer, but it ran, and in David's world, running was enough. The girls were his only thought during those long delivery routes. Megan, serious and observant, who'd started reading chapter books 2 years ahead of her grade level and asked questions about everything from why clouds moved to where their mother had gone. Melissa, the fighter, who'd gotten suspended for 3 days last month for punching a boy who'd called their second-hand clothes poor people clothes. Both of them were brilliant, beautiful, and deserving of so much more than their father could provide on 3 jobs worth of wages. It was the 3rd job that broke David's heart every single day. Evans and Associates Accounting occupied the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house on Maple Street, all dark wood and serious-looking filing cabinets. David arrived there each evening at 6 p.m., after the real employees had gone home to their families and their normal lives. His official title was Evening Administrative Assistant, which was a fancy way of saying he filed paperwork, balanced petty cash, and updated spreadsheets until 10 p.m. every weeknight. The work itself wasn't difficult. David had always been good with numbers. a talent left over from the 2 years of college he'd completed before life had other plans. What made the job difficult was Edith Evans herself thought Mrs. Evans was probably in her mid-60s, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun and clothes that spoke of money without shouting about it. She had pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything and forgive nothing, and a way of speaking that made David feel like he was perpetually disappointing her. She'd hired him 6 months ago after his predecessor had quit without notice, and she'd made it clear from day one that she expected perfection. "Mr. Moore," she'd say in that crisp, measured voice, "the Henderson file is misfiled. The Powell account has a transposition error. The monthly reconciliation is 3 cents off." She never raised her voice, never showed anger, but David could feel her disappointment like a weight on his shoulders. It was the kind of disappointment that reminded him of every teacher who'd suggested he wasn't living up to his potential, every coach who'd said he wasn't trying hard enough, every voice in his head that whispered he wasn't good enough to be raising 2 daughters alone. But the job paid $18 an hour, more than the other 2 combined, and Mrs. Evans had been willing to work around his other schedule when no one else would. So David endured the criticism, corrected his mistakes, and tried to be invisible while he worked. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that Edith Evans stayed late those evenings not to monitor his work, but to watch him. That she noticed the way he rubbed his eyes when he thought no one was looking, evidence of too little sleep and too much responsibility. That she saw how carefully he portioned out the sandwich he brought for dinner, eating half and saving the rest, probably for the next day's lunch. That she observed the gentle way he handled phone calls from his daughter's school, the patience in his voice when Megan called with homework questions, the fierce pride when he mentioned their latest accomplishments to the empty office. Mrs. Evans noticed everything about David Moore. She noticed because she'd been looking for him for 8 years. Ever since the day her daughter Jessica had disappeared with her twin granddaughters, leaving behind only bitter words about wanting nothing to do with the Evans family money and a forwarding address that led nowhere. Edith Evans, billionaire, heiress to a manufacturing fortune that had been built over 4 generations, had been watching her son-in-law work himself to exhaustion just 15 feet away from her desk, night after night, while he remained completely unaware that the stern boss he was so desperate to please was actually the grandmother his daughters had never known they had. But David knew none of this as he locked up the Evans and Associates office at 10:15 p.m. and drove his sputtering Honda back to the apartment where Mrs. Chun from next door would be waiting to be paid her $5 for watching Megan and Melissa. All David knew was that tomorrow would bring another 4:15 a.m. alarm, another marathon day, and another chance to prove that love, determination, and 3 jobs could be enough to give his daughters the life they deserved. He had no idea that everything was about to change. The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. David was halfway through his delivery route, standing in the lobby of Riverside Insurance with a stack of contracts in his hands, when his phone buzzed with the school's number. His heart immediately shifted into the familiar rhythm of parental panic in his world. Calls from Jefferson Elementary during school hours never brought good news. "Mr. Moore? This is Mrs. Rodriguez from the nurse's office." The voice was calm but urgent. "I need you to come pick up Melissa. She's running a fever of 103, and she's been vomiting since lunch." David's hand tightened on the phone. Melissa, his fighter, rarely got sick, and when she did, she usually powered through it with the same stubborn determination she applied to everything else. A fever that high meant she was really sick. "I'll be right there," he said, already calculating the logistics in his head. 20 minutes to get to the school, another 20 to get home. But then what? He couldn't leave Melissa alone while he finished his delivery route, and he certainly couldn't take her with him. The cleaning job would have to be skipped entirely. Mrs. Patterson would understand. She had grandchildren of her own. But the evening shift at Evans and Associates ... David's single quotes. Stomach dropped. Mrs. Evans had made it clear when she hired him that reliability was non-negotiable. "I run a business, Mr. Moore, not a charity," she'd said in that crisp voice. "I need someone I can depend on." He'd never missed a shift, never even been late. But he also couldn't leave his feverish daughter alone while he balanced spreadsheets. He finished the conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez and immediately called Morrison's dispatch to explain he needed to end his route early. Then came the harder call to Evans and Associates. The phone rang 3 times before Mrs. answered in her usual professional tone. "Evans and Associates, Edith speaking." "Mrs. Evans, this is David Moore. I'm calling about tonight's shift." His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "My daughter is sick, really sick, and I need to take her to urgent care. I know this is short notice, but I won't be able to come in tonight." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence on the other end stretched so long that David wondered if the call had dropped. When Mrs. Evans finally spoke, her tone was unreadable. "How sick is she?" "Fever of 103, vomiting. The school nurse says she needs to see a doctor." Another pause. "And you have no other arrangements for her care?" David closed his eyes. "Hear it," was the question that revealed exactly how precarious his situation really was. "No, ma'am, it's just me and the girls." "I see." Mrs. Evans' voice carried a note David couldn't identify. "Take care of your daughter, Mr. Moore. We'll discuss this tomorrow." The line went dead, and David stared at his phone, wondering if he'd just lost the job that kept his family afloat. 20-5 minutes later, he was at Jefferson Elementary, where Melissa sat hunched in a plastic chair in the nurse's office, her normally bright eyes glassy with fever. She looked so small in her oversized hand-me-down sweater, so vulnerable that David's chest physically ached. "Daddy?" she whispered when she saw him. "I don't feel good." "I know, baby. We're going to get you better." He scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt, and carried her to the car where Megan was waiting. Mrs. Rodriguez had called her out of class too, since David couldn't leave one daughter at school while dealing with the other's emergency. The urgent care clinic was packed with the usual mix of industrial accidents and sick children. David sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, holding Melissa while she dozed fitfully against his chest. Megan curled up in the chair beside them working on homework she'd grabbed from her locker. The other families around them had the comfortable look of people whose insurance covered visits like this. People who didn't have to calculate whether a doctor's visit meant skipping groceries that week. When they finally saw the doctor, the diagnosis was straightforward: viral infection, rest, fluids, fever reducer. The bill was $340, which would have to go on the credit card that was already dangerously close to its limit. David signed the paperwork with a pen that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. By the time they got home, it was nearly 6 p.m. Time David should have been walking into Evans and Associates. He settled Melissa on the couch with a cool washcloth and a cup of watered-down Gatorade, the only thing they had that resembled sports drink. Megan helped by reading quietly nearby, her presence a comfort to her twin. David's phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, he was afraid to look at it, certain it would be Mrs. Evans informing him that his services were no longer needed. Instead, the message was from an unknown number. "Mr. Moore, this is Edith Evans. I hope your daughter is feeling better. I'll be working late tonight anyway. Take the time you need. We'll talk tomorrow. E.E." David stared at the message, reading it 3 times. It wasn't warm, exactly, but it wasn't the termination notice he'd expected either. There was something almost considerate about it. What David didn't know was that Edith Evans had spent the past 3 hours doing something she hadn't done in years: leaving her office in the middle of the afternoon. She'd driven to Jefferson Elementary, where she'd spoken quietly with Mrs. Rodriguez in the nurse's office. She'd learned about the Moore family situation, the single father working multiple jobs, the two bright daughters who never complained about their secondhand clothes or the fact that their father couldn't attend school events because he was always working. She'd also driven past David's apartment building, a converted house in the older part of town where paint peeled from the siding, and children played in yards that were more dirt than grass. She'd sat in her luxury sedan car worth more than David made in 2 years, and watched through the window as he carried his sick daughter up the stairs, Megan following behind with a backpack that had been carefully repaired with duct tape. For the first time in 8 years, Edith Evans had seen her granddaughters. Melissa had Jessica's stubborn chin and David's gentle eyes. Megan had inherited the Evans family's keen intelligence. Edith could see it in the way the girl observed everything around her, processing and cataloging information like a miniature scholar. They were beautiful, healthy, and clearly loved. Despite the circumstances that had forced them into David's careful orbit of survival, sitting in her car outside that apartment building, Edith had made a decision that would change everything. But first, she needed to be certain about the kind of man David Moore really was. She needed to understand if he was worthy of the truth she was about to reveal. The sick daughter had given her the perfect opportunity to test his character. Now, she'd seen him choose his family over his job without hesitation, sacrifice his income for his daughter's health without complaint. She'd witnessed the love that motivated his exhaustion, the fierce protectiveness that drove him through 18-hour days. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of revealing who she really was. But tonight, she would let David Moore focus on being the father he'd already proven himself to be: devoted, selfless, and completely unaware that the grandmother his daughters had never known was watching over them all. The inciting incident had been set in motion. The careful distance between Edith Evans and her unknowing family was about to collapse, and nothing would ever be the same. The next morning arrived with the familiar cruelty of a 4:15 a.m. alarm. But this time David's exhaustion carried an extra weight. Melissa's fever had broken around midnight, leaving her weak but no longer burning up. Megan had insisted on sleeping on the floor beside the couch to keep watch, and David had found them both curled together under the thin quilt his mother had made years ago, before cancer had taken her too. He'd managed maybe 3 hours of sleep, and now he faced a day that felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. The urgent care bill sat on his kitchen table like an accusation, $340 that would push his credit card past its limit. The missed evening shift meant $144 less in his next paycheck. And somewhere in the calculations that kept him awake, David realized he was exactly $67 short of rent, which was due in 4 days. Mrs. Chin knocked softly at 6:30 a.m., arriving early as she always did when one of the girls was sick. She was 73, a retired seamstress whose husband had died the previous year, and the $5 David paid her for watching Megan and Melissa was probably as important to her budget as her help was to his schedule. "How is our little fighter?" she asked in her soft accent, immediately moving toward the couch where Melissa was sitting up, pale but alert. "Better," David said, and meant it. "But I need to keep her home today, and I can't miss any more work." Mrs. Chun nodded with the understanding of someone who'd raised children during harder times than these. "She will be safe with me. I will make rice soup very gentle for upset stomach." David pressed the $5 bill into her weathered hands, knowing it represented the difference between lunch and no lunch for him that day. Some sacrifices were so automatic, they didn't even register as choices anymore. The cleaning shift passed in a blur of antiseptic and worry. Mrs. Patterson noticed his distraction but said nothing beyond, "Take care of yourself, David. Can't help your girls if you collapse." By 9 a.m., he was back in the Honda, starting his delivery route with the grim determination of someone who couldn't afford to lose focus. It was during his lunch break, 15 minutes parked outside a law firm, eating half a peanut butter sandwich, that his phone rang. The caller ID showed Evans and Associates. "Mr. Moore? This is Edith Evans. How is your daughter feeling today?" David swallowed his bite of sandwich with difficulty. "Better, thank you. She's resting at home." "Good. I'm calling because I have a proposition for you. Are you familiar with the Henderson account?" David's mind raced. The Henderson account was Evans and Associates' largest client, a Kundo chain of hardware stores that required detailed monthly reconciliations. "Yes, ma'am. I've filed the paperwork, but I've never worked directly on the account." "Well, Mr. Henderson is expanding his business and needs someone to help with bookkeeping at his main location. It's day shift work, Monday through Friday, and it pays significantly more than your current evening position. I recommended you." David nearly dropped his phone. "You recommended me?" "Mr. Henderson needs someone reliable, detail-oriented, and honest. Based on your work here, I believe you meet those qualifications. The position pays $22 an hour, with health insurance after 90 days. Are you interested?" $22 an hour. With benefits. David's mind began calculating automatically. That was nearly double what he made cleaning floors, and it would eliminate the need for the evening shift entirely. He could be home when his daughters finished school. He could attend parent-teacher conferences and school plays. He could stop living like a man running from drowning. "Mr. Moore, are you there?" Yes, I'm very interested. But why would you recommend me?" "I mean, I haven't even been working for you that long, and yesterday I had to miss. Yesterday you chose your daughter's health over your job security. That tells me more about your character than 6 months of perfect attendance records ever could." The words hit David like a physical blow, not painful, but surprising in their gentleness. In all his interactions with Mrs. Evans, he'd never heard her voice carry this tone of something that might have been warmth. "The interview is tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Henderson Hardware on Oak Street. I've already spoken with Mr. Henderson about your qualifications. Don't be late." "Mrs. Evans, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Get the job first. And, Mr. Moore, take tonight off. Your daughter needs you more than my filing system does." The line went dead, leaving David staring at his phone in the parking lot of Morrison and Associates law firm, wondering if he'd imagined the entire conversation. What David couldn't know was that Edith Evans had spent her morning making phone calls that had nothing to do with accounting and everything to do with engineering a future for her granddaughters. Henderson Hardware was indeed expanding, and they did need bookkeeping help. But the position hadn't existed until Edith had called James Henderson at 7 a.m. and offered to forgive a significant debt in exchange for creating a job tailored specifically for David Moore's qualifications. She'd also made another call, this one to Dr. Sarah Mitchell at Millfield Family Practice. Dr. Mitchell owed Edith several favors, actually related to funding for a free clinic Edith had quietly supported for years. The conversation had been brief and specific. David Moore's daughters needed a family doctor who would work with whatever insurance situation emerged, and who understood that financial constraints shouldn't determine the quality of care. The third call had been to Marcus Thompson at First National Bank. Marcus had been eager to accommodate Edith's request to review David Moore's credit situation and offer financial counseling services. Not charity. Edith was careful about that. Legitimate financial guidance that might help David understand options he didn't know existed. Edith Evans was playing a careful game, one that required her to help her family without revealing her identity, to offer assistance without damaging David's pride, and to create opportunities that would improve their lives while appearing to be natural consequences of David's own merit. She was learning to be a grandmother in secret, watching from behind the professional mask she'd worn for so long that sometimes she forgot who she'd been before business had consumed her life. But David's choice the previous day, his immediate, unquestioning prioritization of Melissa's needs over his own financial security, had cracked something in that mask. For the first time in 8 years, Edith allowed herself to hope that her granddaughters were being raised by someone worthy of the love Jessica had been unable to give them. Someone who understood that being a parent meant putting your children's needs above your own fears, your own exhaustion, your own desperate circumstances. Someone like the man she was slowly, carefully beginning to help, one disguised kindness at a time. The interview at Henderson Hardware lasted exactly 12 minutes, which was 11 minutes longer than David had expected it would take for James Henderson to realize he'd made a mistake. Henderson was a man in his late 50s with calloused hands and the kind of direct gaze that suggested he'd built his business by reading people accurately and quickly. "Edith Evans speaks very highly of you," Henderson said, settling behind a desk cluttered with invoices and paint samples. "Says you're the most reliable person she's worked with in 20 years. David shifted in the metal folding chair, uncomfortable with praise he wasn't sure he'd earned. "Mrs. Evans has been generous with her recommendation." "Generous isn't a word most people use to describe Edith," Henderson replied with a slight smile. "Accurate, yes. Fair, absolutely. But generous? That's interesting." The job was exactly what Mrs. Evans had described. Bookkeeping for the hardware store's 3 locations, managing accounts receivable, and handling payroll for 43 employees. The hours were 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. No evenings, no weekends, no juggling schedules around other jobs. It felt too good to be true, which made David suspicious of his own good fortune. "I'll need to give 2 weeks' notice at my other positions," David said carefully. Henderson nodded. "Edith mentioned you're a man who honors his commitments. That's exactly what I need here. Can you start Monday after next?" David left Henderson Hardware in a daze, clutching paperwork that included health insurance forms and a salary figure that was more than he'd made from all 3 jobs combined. For the first time in 18 months, he allowed himself to imagine what it would feel like to pick up his daughters from school, instead of paying Mrs. Chun to watch them, to attend parent-teacher conferences without checking his work schedule. First, to buy groceries without calculating every item. The celebration lasted until he remembered that accepting Henderson's offer meant having a conversation with Mrs. Evans about leaving his evening position. The woman who'd made this opportunity possible deserved better than 2 weeks' notice delivered over the phone. That evening, David arrived at Evans & Associates at his usual 6 p.m., but his familiar routine felt different now. The filing that had once seemed endless now had an expiration date. The careful distance he'd maintained with Mrs. Evans suddenly felt unnecessary. She'd seen him at his most vulnerable, when his daughter was sick, and instead of judging his priorities, she'd helped create a better future. Mrs. Evans was at her desk when he knocked on the doorframe of her office, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed a contract. She looked up as he entered, and for just a moment, David caught something in her expression that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. "Mr. Moore, I trust the interview went well?" "It did. Mr. Henderson offered me the position." David took a breath. "I wanted to thank you personally and to discuss your transition timeline," she finished smoothly. "Of course, 2 weeks' notice would be appropriate." David nodded, then hesitated. "Mrs. Evans, can I ask you something? Why did you help me? I mean, you barely knew me, and I just missed work for the first time. Most employers don't understand what it means to raise children alone." The words hung in the air between them, simple and revealing. David found himself studying her face more carefully, the fine lines around her eyes, the way her hands rested on the desk, the silver ring on her right hand that looked like it had been worn for decades. "You have children?" he asked quietly. A shadow crossed her features so quickly, David almost missed it. I had a daughter. We lost touch some years ago. I'm sorry. Yes, Mrs. Evans said simply. So am I. Something shifted in that moment. A recognition that they both carried losses that shaped their understanding of what mattered. David found himself speaking before he'd planned to. My daughters ask about their grandparents sometimes. I never know what to tell them. Their mother's parents died before they were born, and my mother passed when they were babies. They don't understand why some families have grandparents and others don't. Mrs. Evans removed her reading glasses and set them down with careful precision. What do you tell them? That families come in all different shapes. That love is what makes people. Family, not just blood. David paused. But I think they still wonder what it would be like to have grandparents who spoiled them a little. And what would you want grandparents to be like for them? The question was asked so casually that David almost missed the intensity behind it. Someone who saw how special they are. Someone who understood that Megan reads everything she can get her hands on and asks questions that would stump college professors. Someone who noticed that Melissa fights for anyone she thinks is being treated unfairly, even when it gets her in trouble. David smiled without realizing it. Someone who loved them for exactly who they are, not who they might become. Mrs. Evans was quiet for a long moment, her pale blue eyes fixed on something beyond the window. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note David had never heard before, something that might have been longing. They sound like remarkable young ladies. They are. They're the best thing I've ever done with my life. I'm sure their mother would be proud. David's expression hardened slightly. Their mother chose to leave. That was her decision. People sometimes make choices they later regret, Mrs. Evans said carefully. Sometimes circumstances or pride or fear make it difficult to find the way back to what matters most. There was something in her tone that made David look at her more closely, but before he could analyze it, she was standing and moving toward the filing cabinet. Well, she said briskly, back to her professional demeanor, let's discuss your remaining responsibilities here. I'll want you to train whoever replaces you, which means we should start documenting your processes. The moment of personal connection had passed, but something had changed between them. Over the following days, their evening conversations became less formal. Mrs. Evans began asking about Megan and Melissa's school projects, their interests, their personalities. David found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone, funny things they'd said, creative solutions they'd invented for problems, the way they took care of each other with an instinct that amazed him. What David didn't notice was how Mrs. Evans absorbed every detail, how her questions became more specific, how she seemed to hang on his descriptions of their daily lives. He didn't see her write notes in a personal journal she kept locked in her desk drawer, or notice how she'd begun leaving work earlier on Fridays, something she hadn't done in 20 years. Mrs. Evans was learning to be a grandmother through stories, piecing together the personalities of granddaughters she was still afraid to claim, building a relationship with a son-in-law who didn't know that the woman helping him rebuild his life was the mother of the woman who'd abandoned him. Trust was growing in careful increments, one evening conversation at a time. Neither of them knew they were practicing being family. It was during David's final week at Evans & Associates that the walls finally came down. The transition had been smoother than either had expected. Mrs. Evans had hired a replacement, a recent graduate named Robert White, who possessed technical skills but lacked David's intuitive understanding of the work. Training Robert gave David and Mrs. Evans a reason to spend more time together, and somehow, in those extended evening conversations, the careful professional distance they'd maintained began to dissolve. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night, when David found Mrs. Evans staring at a framed photograph on her desk, something he'd never noticed before, probably because she usually kept it turned away. The picture showed a young woman with dark hair and defiant eyes, holding a baby in each arm. Even in the small frame, David could see the stubborn set of the woman's jaw, the way she held herself like someone preparing for a fight. "She's beautiful," David said quietly, assuming it was a relative. "Your daughter?" Mrs. Evans's hand trembled slightly as she turned the frame face down. "Yes, Jessica. This was taken when the twins were about 6 months old." Something cold settled in David's stomach. Twins, 6 months old. The timing, the dark hair visible in the photograph, the familiar shape of the babies' faces, it couldn't be a coincidence. "Mrs. Evans," David said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, "what was your daughter's last name?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Mrs. Evans looked at him with eyes that suddenly seemed ancient, weighted with years of secrets and sorrow. "Moore," she said finally. "Jessica Evans Moore. She married a young man named David, had twin daughters. Then she disappeared one day and took the babies with her. That was 8 years ago." The office seemed to tilt around David. His legs found the nearest chair without conscious direction from his brain. 8 years ago. Megan and Melissa had been 6 months old when Jessica had insisted they leave Colorado, claimed she needed space from her family's suffocating expectations. She'd made it sound like a temporary move, a chance to figure things out. David had never questioned it because he'd been 23 and drowning in new parenthood, grateful that someone was making decisions while he learned how to change diapers and decode different types of crying. "You single quotes double quotes." David couldn't finish the sentence. "Their grandmother, yes." Mrs. Evans Edith, his mother-in-law, sat down heavily in her chair. "I've been watching you work yourself to death every night for 6 months, knowing exactly who you were, knowing my granddaughters were sleeping in that apartment across town, and not having any idea how to tell you the truth." David's mind raced through months of interactions, reinterpreting every conversation, every kindness, every moment of unexpected understanding. The job at Henderson Hardware. "You didn't just recommend me, you created it. James owed me a favor. Several favors, actually." Edith's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "I needed to help you without making it seem like charity. You're too proud for that, and you shouldn't have to be grateful for what should have been your daughter's birthright from the beginning." "Their birthright?" David felt anger building alongside his shock. "Where were you when Jessica left? Where were you when I was working 3 jobs to keep them fed? Where were you when Melissa was sick and I couldn't afford the doctor?" Edith flinched but didn't look away. "I was looking for you. Jessica made sure I couldn't find you. She used your last name, moved to a different state, cut all contact. She was so angry with me, with our whole family. She said she'd rather raise her daughters in poverty than let them grow up with Evans. Money and Evans' expectations." "What expectations?" David's voice was sharp with 8 years of accumulated exhaustion and frustration. "The same ones that cost me my daughter," Edith said quietly. "I built a business empire, David. 4 generations of Evans family money, all managed and multiplied and invested until we had more wealth than any family could ever need. But I forgot how to be a mother while I was learning to be a CEO." She turned to look out the window, her reflection ghost-like in the darkened glass. "Jessica was brilliant, smarter than me, more creative, more compassionate. But I kept pushing her toward business, toward the company, toward the life I thought she should want. When she told me she was pregnant with twins at 19, I didn't celebrate. I talked about interrupted education and derailed career plans. When she married you, a good man from a working-class family, I worried about your motives instead of trusting her judgment." David felt his anger shifting, not disappearing but becoming more complex. "So she ran. And she took the most precious things in my life with her." Edith's voice cracked slightly. "I spent 8 years trying to find you, and when I finally did, you were working in my building, struggling to provide for my granddaughters while I sat 15 feet away every night, Too afraid to tell you who I was. Afraid of what? Afraid you'd think I was trying to take them from you. Afraid you'd hate me for the mistakes I made with Jessica. Afraid that my granddaughters would see me the way their mother did, as someone who valued money and control, more than love and family. David stared at this woman who had been hiding in plain sight, seeing her clearly for the first time. The careful way she'd asked about Megan and Melissa's interests. The gentle questions about their personalities. The invisible assistance that had made his life easier without damaging his pride. "You've been trying to help us without us knowing," he said slowly. "I've been trying to be the grandmother I should have been from the beginning, without disrupting the family you've built. You're a good father, David. Better than I ever was as a mother. I didn't want to interfere with that." The weight of revelation settled over David like a blanket, heavy but somehow comforting. For 18 months he'd carried the responsibility of his daughters alone, making every decision through the lens of scarcity and fear. Now suddenly, they weren't alone. They had family, complicated, imperfect family with a painful history, but family nonetheless. What happens now? David asked. Edith turned back to face him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked uncertain, vulnerable. "That depends on you. I don't want to impose on the life you've built, or confuse the girls, or make things harder. But I would like," she paused, gathering courage, "I would like to know my granddaughters. If you'll let me." David thought about Megan's questions about why some families had grandparents and others didn't. He thought about Melissa's fierce protectiveness toward anyone she loved. He thought about the loneliness he'd carried, the weight of making every decision without guidance or support. "They don't know anything about you," he said carefully. "Jessica never talked about her family. I understand, we can take it slowly. However you think is best." David studied her face. This woman who had engineered a better job for him, who had watched him struggle and found ways to help without humiliation, who had lost her daughter to her own mistakes and spent 8 years trying to find a way back to love. "I think," David said slowly, "they would like to meet their grandmother." For the first time since he'd known her, Edith Evans smiled, not the professional expression she wore during business hours, but something real and warm and heartbreakingly hopeful. "I would like that too," she whispered. "More than you know." The truth was finally out, hanging in the air between them like the beginning of something neither had dared to hope for. But David was beginning to understand that the most important things in life, love, family, second chances, rarely came in the packages you expected. The conversation about how to introduce Edith to Megan and Melissa took 3 days and countless revisions. David found himself calling her at odd hours during his lunch break at Henderson Hardware, after the girls went to bed, even once at 6 a.m. when he couldn't sleep for worrying about how to explain 8 years of absent grandmother to 2 8-year-olds who had learned not to ask for things that seemed impossible. "What if we start simple?" Edith suggested during one of these calls. "Maybe I could just be Mrs. Evans, a friend of yours from work. Someone who would like to meet them, with no pressure. About the family connection until they're comfortable." David appreciated the thoughtfulness behind the suggestion, but something in him rebelled against starting their relationship with another deception. "They've had enough adults in their lives who weren't honest with them," he said quietly. "Their mother left without explanation. I've been too exhausted to answer half their questions properly. I think they deserve the truth, even if it's complicated." So on a Saturday afternoon in late October, David sat his daughters down at their small kitchen table with hot chocolate and the kind of serious expression that immediately got their attention. Megan closed her book and gave him her full focus. Melissa stopped bouncing in her chair and studied his face with the intensity she usually reserved for people she thought might be hiding something important. "I need to tell you about someone," David began. "Someone who's been looking for us for a very long time." He told them about their mother's family, about the grandmother they'd never known existed, about how sometimes adults make mistakes that hurt people they love. He explained that Mrs. Evans from his evening job was actually their grandmother Edith, who had been trying to find them since they were babies. Megan absorbed the information with her typical analytical approach. So Mom had a mom, and we have a grandma, but they had a fight? Something like that. Melissa was more direct. Where has she been? Why didn't she find us before? David had wondered the same thing, but Edith's explanation made sense in the painful way that family estrangements often did. She was looking, but your mom made it hard to find us. And I think she was scared. Scared of what? Melissa's protective instincts were clearly activated. Scared that we might not want to know her. Scared that she might not be good at being a grandmother. The girls exchanged one of their silent twin communications, an entire conversation conducted in glances and subtle expressions that David had learned not to interrupt. Can we meet her? Megan asked finally. She would like to meet you, but only if you want to. No pressure, no expectations. Just getting to know each other. Melissa considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. Does she know we like different things? I mean, we're twins, but we're not the same person. David smiled despite his nervousness. She knows. I've told her about Megan's books and Melissa's sense of justice. She knows you're both brilliant and strong and completely yourselves. Okay, Megan said, with characteristic decisiveness. We can meet her. The meeting was arranged for the following Sunday at Riverside Park, neutral territory where the girls could escape to the playground if adult conversation became overwhelming. David arrived early, partly from nerves and partly because he wanted to see Edith's face when she first saw her granddaughters in daylight, as family instead of distant observations. Edith was already there when they arrived, sitting on a bench near the duck pond wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual business attire. The transformation was remarkable. She looked younger, softer, more like someone's grandmother and less like a corporate executive. When she saw them approaching, she stood slowly, as if sudden movements might break the spell. Megan, Melissa. Her voice was careful, warm, but not presumptuous. I'm so happy to finally meet you properly. The girls flanked David, curious but cautious. Melissa spoke first, as she usually did in new situations. You don't look like a grandmother. Edith laughed, a sound David had never heard from her before. What do grandmothers usually look like? Gray hair in a bun. Cookies, hugs that smell like perfume. Melissa paused. Do you make cookies? I'm afraid I'm not very good at cooking. But I'm an excellent learner if you'd be willing to teach me. Megan tilted her head, studying Edith with scientific interest. Dad says you run a business. What kind of business? I help other businesses manage their money. It's not very exciting. Do you like it? Edith considered the question seriously. I used to think I did. Lately, I've been wondering if there are more important things to focus on. The conversation continued carefully, with David watching both sides navigate the delicate territory of new relationship. Edith asked thoughtful questions without pushing for intimate details. The girls shared information about school and friends without the guarded quality they often showed with new adults. After an hour, when the initial awkwardness had settled into something that might eventually become comfort, Melissa made an announcement that surprised everyone. We should probably tell you that Dad works really hard for us, and we don't need anyone to feel sorry for us. David started to interrupt, but Edith held up a gentle hand. Thank you for telling me that, she said to Melissa. I can see how hard your dad works, and I don't feel sorry for you. I feel proud of all three of you. You've built something beautiful together. Megan nodded approvingly. Good, because Dad's the best dad ever, even when he's tired. I can see that, Edith said, looking at David with something that might have been admiration. He's doing an extraordinary job. Over the following weeks, Sunday meetings became routine. Sometimes they went to the park, sometimes to the children's museum, once to a bookstore where Edith watched in amazement as Megan selected books with the confidence of someone twice her age. Edith was learning to be a grandmother through careful observation and gentle participation, while the girls were learning to trust this new adult who asked their opinions, respected their boundaries, and never tried to replace their fathers. Authority. The shift from careful introduction to genuine partnership happened gradually. When David mentioned struggling to help Megan with a science project about genetics, Edith offered access to her company's research library. When Melissa expressed interest in art classes they couldn't afford, Edith suggested community programs she was aware of through her business connections programs that offered scholarships for families in transition. But the most significant change was in David himself. For the first time in years, he had someone to share parenting decisions with, someone who understood the weight of responsibility he carried. Edith didn't try to take over or impose her judgment, but she offered perspective, resources, and the simple relief of knowing he wasn't alone. "I never expected this," David told her one Sunday evening as they watched the girls feed ducks at the pond. "I thought you'd either want to take over completely or disappear again. I'm too old for either extreme," Edith replied. "I just want to be useful to them. To you. I lost too many years trying to control what couldn't be controlled. And now?" She smiled, watching Melissa carefully explain to a younger visitor the proper way to feed ducks without frightening them. "Now I'm learning that the best gifts are the ones you earn through showing up, day after day, without expecting anything in return." They were becoming family, not the traditional kind, but the kind built through choice and commitment, and the daily decision to care for each other's well-being. It was messy and imperfect, and more valuable than any of them had imagined possible. By December, the transformation was visible to anyone who knew how to look. David had traded his exhausted desperation for something that resembled actual planning, not just surviving each day, but thinking ahead to next month, next year, even next decade. The girls had begun including Grandma Edith in their casual conversations, not as a novelty, but as a permanent fixture in their expanding world. The first real test of their partnership came when Megan's teacher, Mrs. Foster, requested a conference about placing her in the gifted program. It was the kind of opportunity David had dreamed about, but never thought he could navigate. Specialized curricula, summer programs, educational pathways that required advanced planning, and resources he didn't understand. "I don't know what questions to ask," David admitted to Edith over coffee at the diner near Henderson Hardware. They'd started meeting for lunch once a week, ostensibly to discuss the girls' needs, but increasingly to share the kind of parenting concerns that felt too big to carry alone. "Then we'll figure it out together," Edith said simply. "I may not know much about 8-year-olds, but I know how to research options and evaluate programs." The conference became a collaborative effort. David brought his intimate knowledge of Megan's learning style and personality. Edith arrived with printed research about gifted education programs, questions about curriculum differentiation, and a contact list of parents who'd navigated similar decisions. Together, they advocated for an approach that would challenge Megan intellectually without overwhelming her socially. Mrs. Foster was clearly impressed by their preparation. "It's refreshing to see parents who've done their homework," she said, looking between David and Edith with approval. Too often, families either dismiss gifted programs as elitist or expect them to solve all their educational concerns without understanding what's actually involved. Walking out of Jefferson Elementary that afternoon, David felt something he hadn't experienced since becoming a single parent: confidence in his ability to give his daughters the opportunities they deserved. The success with Megan's education opened other doors. When Melissa expressed interest in joining the community theater's youth program, Edith didn't just find information about auditions. She discovered that the theater needed volunteers for set construction and offered to coordinate David's carpentry skills with their seasonal productions. Suddenly, Melissa had access to theater classes while David earned extra income doing work he actually enjoyed. "You're good at this," commented Janet Morrison, the theater's artistic director, watching David install custom shelving in the costume storage room. Professional quality work. "Have you considered expanding beyond small repairs?" The question planted a seed that grew over several conversations with Edith. David had always been skilled with his hands, but survival mode had limited him to quick fixes and maintenance work. With steady income from Henderson Hardware and Edith's encouragement, he began taking on custom projects, built-in bookcases for neighbors, restored furniture for antique dealers, even a commissioned playground structure for a local daycare. "You have an artist's eye," Edith observed, running her hand along a cabinet David had designed for his apartment's tiny kitchen. "These joints are perfect, but more than that, the proportions are beautiful. This isn't just functional, it's elegant." David had never thought of his work in those terms, but Edith's recognition gave him permission to see his craftsmanship as more than just necessity. When she suggested he document his projects and consider advertising his services, he initially resisted. "I'm not a businessman," he protested. "No," Edith agreed, "but I am. And you're an artist who happens to be excellent at business fundamentals. You show up on time, you deliver what you promise, and you treat people fairly. The rest can be learned." By February, David Moore Custom Woodworking had 3 projects booked through spring and a waiting list for summer work. The business operated from the garage behind his apartment building, but Edith had quietly ensured he had access to professional-grade tools and workspace that made quality results possible. The girls were thriving in ways that went beyond their individual achievements. Megan's confidence had blossomed as she tackled advanced coursework without losing her connection to friends in regular classes. Melissa had landed a speaking role in the theater's spring production and was learning to channel her natural intensity into dramatic performance. More importantly, they were learning what it felt like to have a support system that extended beyond their father's exhausted devotion. When Megan needed research materials for a project about local history, Edith connected her with the town librarian who specialized in archival records. When Melissa struggled with memorizing lines, David built her a portable practice stage in their living room while Edith contributed professional acting coaching through a contact at the Regional Arts Council. "It's like having a whole team," Melissa observed one Sunday evening as they walked through downtown Millfield after dinner at Romano's, a restaurant they could now afford occasionally. "Dad builds things and fixes things and makes us feel safe. Grandma Edith knows people and finds opportunities and helps us think bigger." Megan nodded thoughtfully. "And we help too. We're all taking care of each other." The observation was more profound than an 8-year-old should have been able to articulate, but it captured exactly what had evolved between them. They'd become a functioning family unit where each member contributed their strengths and compensated for others' limitations. The community was beginning to notice as well. At the hardware store, customers specifically requested David's advice on complex projects. Parents at school events sought out both David and Edith for recommendations about resources and opportunities. The theater group had started referring other organizations to David for custom construction work. "You've become quite the local success story," James Henderson mentioned one afternoon, watching David explain joint techniques to a customer planning a deck renovation. "People talk about the single dad who turned his life around, started his own business, raised remarkable daughters. Makes for good conversation at the Rotary Club." David was uncomfortable with the attention, but Edith helped him understand its value. "Recognition isn't about ego," she explained. "It's about establishing trust in the community. When people know your story, they're more likely to support your business, recommend your services, and invest in your family's success." She was teaching him to think strategically about reputation and relationships, lessons that had taken her decades to learn in the corporate world, but that she could distill into Practical guidance for someone building a different kind of future. The growth wasn't just financial or professional. David was rediscovering parts of himself that had been buried under years of survival mode. His creativity was emerging through his woodworking projects. His confidence was rebuilding through success and collaboration. His capacity for joy was expanding as he watched his daughters flourish in an environment of genuine opportunity rather than constant limitation. Edith was changing too, in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. The corporate executive, who had once scheduled meetings during family holidays, now blocked out Sunday afternoons as permanently unavailable. The woman who had viewed emotion as a business liability was learning to celebrate Melissa's theatrical triumphs and Megan's academic achievements with grandmother's pride. "I'm happier than I've been in 20 years, she confided to David one evening after attending Megan's science fair presentation. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be proud of something that actually mattered." They were building momentum that felt sustainable rather than frantic progress, based on collaboration and mutual support rather than individual heroics. For the first time in years, David could envision a future that extended beyond next month's bills and next week's crises. None of them knew that their carefully constructed new normal was about to face the kind of test that would either prove the strength of their bonds or reveal the limitations of what good intentions could overcome. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by certified mail to David's apartment with the kind of official weight that immediately signaled trouble. David signed for it with hands that had learned to shake whenever unexpected legal documents appeared. Too many years of overdue notices and collection threats had trained his nervous system to expect the worst. But this wasn't about money. Letterhead belonged to Patterson & Associates, a law firm in Denver. The contents were typed in formal legal language that took David 3 readings to fully comprehend. And when he finally understood what he was looking at, his coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor. Petition for modification of custody arrangement and relocation of minor children. Filed by Jessica Evans Moore, requesting full custody of Megan and Melissa Moore, with intent to relocate to California within 60 days. Jessica was back. After 8 years of silence, of abandonment, of leaving her daughters to wonder why their mother had walked away without explanation, she was back and demanding the right to take them away from the only stable home they'd ever known. David called in sick to Henderson Hardware for the first time since he'd started working there, then drove straight to Evans & Associates with the letter clutched in his hand like evidence of a crime. Edith took one look at his face and cleared her schedule for the rest of the day. "She can't just show up and take them," David said, pacing her office like a caged animal. "Can she? I mean, legally, I've had sole custody for 18 months. I'm their primary parent. I'm the one who..." "David." Edith's voice was calm but strained. "Sit down. Let me read this carefully." She examined the legal documents with the same methodical attention she applied to complex business contracts, but David could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages. When she finished reading, she set the papers down and removed her glasses with deliberate precision. "This is comprehensive," she said finally. "Jessica has hired excellent attorneys." "What does that mean?" Edith met his eyes with an expression that tried to be reassuring but couldn't quite hide her concern. "It means she's arguing that her previous abandonment was due to postpartum depression and financial instability, that she's now established in California with a stable relationship and substantial income, and that the girls would benefit from being reunited with their mother." "Postpartum depression?" David's voice rose. "She left when they were 18 months old. And she never called, never wrote, never sent a birthday card." "I know. But depression can be a compelling legal argument, especially if she has medical records to support the claim." Edith paused. "There's something else. She's arguing that you've been an unfit guardian because you've exposed the children to unstable living conditions and inconsistent care arrangements. David felt the floor tilt beneath him. Unstable? I've worked 3 jobs to keep them fed and housed. I've never left them alone, never put them in danger. She's citing the period when you were working multiple jobs, leaving them with neighbors, struggling financially. Her lawyers are painting a picture of neglect through poverty. The cruelty of it hit David like a physical blow. Every sacrifice he'd made, every 18-hour day he'd endured, every moment he'd chosen his daughter's needs over his own exhaustion. Jessica's attorneys were twisting it all into evidence of inadequate parenting. She can't win, David said. Desperately. Can she? The girls barely remember her. They have a life here, friends at school, the theater program. Courts generally favor biological parents, especially mothers, when they can demonstrate rehabilitation and stability. Edith's professional mask was slipping, revealing the grandmother beneath the businesswoman. And Jessica has advantages. Now, the legal filing indicates she's married to someone named Marcus Thompson, who has significant financial resources. They own a home in Palo Alto. She's completed a master's degree in early childhood education. On paper, they can offer the girls opportunities She stopped herself, but David heard the unfinished thought. Opportunities we can't match. Not legally, anyway. Because as far as the court system knew, David was still a single father working at a hardware store, and Edith was just a family friend with no legal standing to help. There's a hearing scheduled for next month, Edith continued. We need to respond, and we need excellent legal representation. I can't afford excellent legal representation. David's voice was hollow. I can barely afford adequate legal representation. Edith was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk in a pattern David had learned to recognize as deep thinking. David, there's something we need to discuss. Something that could change our legal position considerably. What do you mean? I mean that Jessica is basing her case partly on your financial limitations and social isolation. But if you weren't isolated, if you had family support, financial stability, and community connections that could be documented, it might strengthen your position significantly. David stared at her, not understanding where she was heading. I'm talking about our relationship, Edith said carefully. Right now, I'm legally a stranger to you and the girls. But if we formalized our family connection, if I could officially support your custody claim as their grandmother, but that would mean revealing everything to the court. Jessica would know you found us. Yes. Edith's voice was steady but sad. And she would probably be furious. It might destroy any chance of reconciliation between us. But David, I won't let her take those girls away from you. Not when I've seen the father you've become, the home you've built for them. The weight of the decision settled over David like a storm cloud. Accepting Edith's help would mean exposing their carefully built family to legal scrutiny and Jessica's potential fury. But fighting alone with limited resources would mean risking everything he'd worked to protect. What do we tell Megan and Melissa? He asked. Edith's professional composure finally cracked. We tell them the truth. That their mother wants them to come live with her in California, and that we're going to fight to keep them here where they belong. That evening, David sat his daughters down for the most difficult conversation of his life. He explained that their mother had returned and wanted them to live with her, that there would be lawyers and court hearings and difficult decisions ahead. Megan's response was characteristically direct. But we want to stay here, with you and Grandma Edith. Melissa was more confrontational. She can't just take us. We're not things she left behind and now wants back. But David could see the confusion beneath their defiance, the way they were grappling with loyalty conflicts no 8-year-old should have to navigate. Their mother, a figure more mythical than real in their daily lives, was suddenly demanding their presence, their love, their future. What happens if we have to go? Megan asked quietly. David pulled girls close, trying to project confidence. He didn't feel, "We're going to fight this," he said. "All of us together. Grandma Edith and I. We're not going to let anyone take you away from the family we've built." But as he held his daughters and felt them tremble against him, David wondered if love and determination would be enough to overcome legal precedent and Jessica's newfound advantages. For the first time since that morning, 8 years ago when he'd found Jessica's goodbye note, David faced the possibility that being a good father might not be enough to keep his children. The crisis had arrived, and everything they'd built together, the trust, the stability, the carefully reconstructed life, hung in the balance of a legal system that measured families by documentation rather than devotion. The response began quietly, like most important movements do, with one person who refused to accept that good people should suffer for doing the right thing. Mrs. Foster, Megan's teacher, had heard about the custody battle through the school's administrative network, and she spent her Saturday morning doing something that would have surprised her principal, researching legal precedents for teacher testimony in custody cases. By Monday afternoon, she was sitting in David's living room with a manila folder full of documentation, Megan's academic records, behavioral assessments, and detailed notes about the child's emotional stability and social development over the past 2 years. "I've been teaching for 23 years, Mrs. Foster said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd seen thousands of children navigate family crises. "I know what instability looks like in a child's academic performance, their social interactions, their emotional regulation. Megan shows none of those signs. She's thriving, not just surviving, but actively flourishing in ways that only happen when a child feels completely secure in their home environment." David stared at the documentation, overwhelmed by the thoroughness of her advocacy. "Mrs. Foster, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did. Because in 3 weeks, I'm going to testify in that courtroom about what I've observed. And every teacher at Jefferson Elementary who's worked with your daughters is prepared to do the same." The folder contained letters from Melissa's art teacher, praising her creativity and confidence. Notes from the music instructor about both girls' participation in the school choir. Even a statement from the cafeteria supervisor who had noticed how the twins looked out for younger students and always said please and thank you, small details that spoke to the values they'd learned at home. But Mrs. Foster's intervention was just the beginning. Janet Morrison from the community theater called that evening with news that left David speechless. "The entire theater board met yesterday," she said, "and we've decided to write a formal letter to the court about Melissa's involvement in our program. But more than that, we're organizing a character witness event. Everyone who's worked with your family, parents, volunteers, other kids, they want to speak on your behalf." "I don't understand," David said. "Why would people get involved in something that doesn't concern them?" Janet laughed, a warm sound that carried years of community theater experience. "David, you've been part of this community for 8 years. You think people haven't noticed? You think they haven't seen you at every school event, even when you were exhausted from working 3 jobs? You think they missed how you built that playground equipment for the daycare without charging for labor, or how you fixed Mrs. Patterson's front steps when she couldn't afford a contractor?" David had forgotten about Mrs. Patterson's steps, a quick repair job he'd done the previous fall when he'd noticed her struggling with loose boards. It hadn't seemed significant at the time, just neighborly help. "People remember kindness," Janet continued, "and they remember consistency. You've been showing up for this community for years. Now the community wants to show up for you." The next surprise came from James Henderson, who appeared at David's apartment Tuesday evening with a proposal that initially sounded like charity but revealed itself as something more complex. "I've been thinking about expanding the business," Henderson said, settling into David's repaired kitchen chair. "Adding a custom carpentry division to complement the hardware sales. I'd need someone to run it, someone who understands both the technical side and the customer service side." David frowned. "Mr. Henderson, If this is about the custody case, it's about business, Henderson interrupted firmly. I've been watching. You work for months. Customers trust you. Your craftsmanship is excellent, and you understand how to manage projects efficiently. The fact that you're dealing with legal challenges doesn't change your qualifications. He pulled out a folder containing business projections, partnership agreements, and financial forecasts. I'm offering you a partnership stake in Henderson. Hardware and custom carpentry. 20% ownership, management salary, and profit sharing. It's a legitimate business opportunity that happens to strengthen your financial position significantly. The offer was staggering, not just the money, but the security and professional recognition it represented. Henderson was essentially offering David a path to business ownership and long-term stability, timed perfectly to demonstrate his reliability and community integration to the court. Why? David asked simply. Henderson smiled. Because 3 years ago, when my wife was in the hospital for cancer surgery, you spent your day off building wheelchair ramps for our house. You wouldn't take payment, said it was just what neighbors do for each other. We never forgot that. David barely remembered the ramps, another small gesture that had seemed natural at the time. But Henderson's wife had recovered, and they'd apparently spent the intervening years looking for ways to repay kindness that David had never expected to be repaid. The most surprising intervention came from an entirely unexpected source. Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor who had watched Megan and Melissa for years. She appeared at Edith's office on Wednesday afternoon, dressed in her best clothes and carrying a handwritten letter in careful English. I want to help, she told Edith simply. Those girls, they are my family too. Mrs. Chun's letter, translated by her grandson and notarized at the bank, was a detailed account of David's parenting over the past 18 months. She had observed him during sick days, homework struggles, bedtime routines, and ordinary daily interactions. Her testimony carried particular weight because she had no financial stake in the outcome, just an elderly widow's clear-eyed assessment of the father she'd watched raise his daughters with consistent love and patience. He never raised voice. She had written, even when very tired, very worried about money, he is always gentle with his girls. They run to him when he come home, not because they fear him, but because they love him. This is good father. But the most powerful intervention came from a source none of them had anticipated. Megan and Melissa themselves. The idea emerged during one of their conversations with Edith about the court proceedings. Megan, with characteristic directness, had asked why they couldn't simply tell the judge what they wanted. When Edith explained that 8-year-olds' preferences carried limited legal weight, Melissa had countered with typical determination. Then we'll show them, she said. We'll make something that proves we belong here. What they created, working together over several evenings, was a presentation that demonstrated their integration into their community in ways that transcended legal arguments. They photographed themselves at school, at theater rehearsals, in the library where they volunteered, reading to younger children. They collected letters from friends, drawings of their family that included Edith, and a timeline of their growth and achievements since living with David. But the centerpiece was a video project Megan had conceived and Melissa had helped execute. Interviews with community members talking about the Moore family's impact on their lives. Mrs. Patterson talking about David's reliability and kindness. Theater parents discussing Melissa's positive influence on their own children. Teachers describing both girls' academic progress and emotional stability. The video wasn't professionally produced, but it captured something no legal brief could convey: the authentic connections David had built through years of consistent presence in his daughters' lives and his community. It showed a family woven into the fabric of Millfield in ways that couldn't be easily replicated elsewhere. When David watched the finished video, he was stunned not just by its quality, but by the realization of how many lives his family had touched. He'd been so focused on survival on providing basic necessities and protection, that he'd failed to notice the network of relationships and mutual support they'd gradually built. "You see," Edith said softly as the video ended, "you didn't just raise your daughters in isolation. You raised them in community. And that community recognizes the value of what you've built together." The unexpected support continued to materialize. Throughout the week, the hardware store's regular customers organized a letter-writing campaign. Parents from the theater program offered to testify about David's character and the girls' happiness. Even Dr. Mitchell from the family practice clinic volunteered to provide expert testimony about the girls' physical and emotional health. By Friday, David's attorney, a family law specialist Edith had quietly retained, was reviewing a file thick with community support that went far beyond typical character references. It was documentation of a family deeply rooted in their community, surrounded by people who had witnessed their daily life and chosen to advocate for their preservation. "I've never seen anything quite like this," the attorney admitted. Usually, custody cases involve competing claims about parental fitness. This case involves an entire community vouching for a father's character and his children's well-being. The unexpected interventions had transformed their legal position, but more importantly, they had revealed something David had never fully understood: that 8 years of small kindnesses, consistent presence, and genuine care for others had created a network of relationships that would rally to protect what mattered most. They weren't facing Jessica's legal challenge alone. They were facing it as part of a community that had decided the Moore family was worth fighting for. The courtroom in Millfield's county courthouse had never seen anything quite like the gathering that assembled on the morning of April 15th. Judge Patricia Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of family court proceedings, paused in reviewing her case files to observe the unusual crowd filling the gallery. Typically, custody hearings attracted only immediate family members and perhaps a character witness or two. This morning, she counted nearly 40 people, ranging from elderly neighbors to young teachers to parents with their own children in tow. David sat at the plaintiff's table wearing his best suit, the one he'd bought for job interviews 2 years ago and had worn exactly 3 times since. Beside him, his attorney Sarah Mitchell, no relation to Dr. Mitchell, organized documents with the confident efficiency of someone who knew they held a winning hand. Behind them, Edith occupied the first row with Megan and Melissa flanking her, the girls dressed in their Sunday best but maintaining the serious expressions they'd practiced for weeks. At the defendant's table, Jessica sat with her legal team and the man David assumed was her new husband. She looked prosperous and polished in ways that reminded David of the young woman he'd fallen in love with 12 years ago, before parenthood and poverty had worn the edges off both their dreams. Her attorney, a sharp-suited woman from Denver, projected the kind of confidence that came from representing clients who could afford thorough preparation. Jessica hadn't looked directly at David or the girls since entering the courtroom. Whether from guilt, strategy, or emotional overwhelm, she kept her attention focused on her legal papers and whispered conferences with her attorney. Judge Rodriguez called the proceedings to order and outlined the case. Jessica Evans Moore's petition for modification of custody and relocation of minor children, Megan and Melissa Moore, currently in the primary custody of their father, David Moore. Jessica's attorney presented their case first, painting a picture of a young mother overwhelmed by postpartum depression, who had made the painful decision to leave her children in their father's care while she sought treatment and stability. They presented medical records documenting Jessica's mental health struggles, financial statements showing her current stability, and educational records demonstrating her recent completion of a master's degree in early childhood development. "My client deeply regrets the pain her absence caused," the attorney argued, "but she was acting in the best interests of her children by ensuring they remained with their father while she was unable to provide adequate care. Now, 8 years later, she has achieved the stability and resources necessary to provide her daughters with opportunities that simply aren't available in their current circumstances. The argument was compelling in its clinical precision. On paper, Jessica could offer private schools, college funds, cultural enrichment, and the kind of advantages that money could buy. Her home in Palo Alto was featured in the legal documents: 4 bedrooms, excellent schools, proximity to Stanford University, where her husband taught economics. But when David's attorney began presenting their case, the clinical narrative gave way to something more powerful: the texture of daily life lived with intention and love. Mrs. Foster testified first, describing Megan's academic excellence and social confidence in terms that made clear these weren't natural gifts but cultivated achievements. "In my 23 years of teaching," she said, "I've learned to recognize the difference between children who are simply bright and children who are intellectually nurtured. Megan doesn't just excel academically, she approaches learning with the confidence of someone who knows her curiosity is valued and supported at home." Janet Morrison followed with testimony about Melissa's growth through theater participation. "When Melissa first auditioned," she explained, "she was talented but guarded. Over the past year, we've watched her develop not just as a performer, but as a leader. She mentors younger students, takes responsibility for group projects, and approaches challenges with resilience that speaks to the emotional security she derives from her home environment." Mrs. Chun's testimony, delivered through a translator despite her functional English, carried unexpected weight. Her detailed observations of David's parenting, the patience during homework struggles, the gentle consistency during bedtime routines, the way he prioritized his daughter's emotional needs, even during his most exhausted moments, painted a picture of fatherhood that transcended financial resources. But the testimony that shifted the courtroom's atmosphere came from an unexpected source: Henderson's description of David's business partnership and community integration. "Your Honor," Henderson said, "I didn't offer David Moore a partnership because I felt sorry for him. I offered it because in 18 months of working together, he's demonstrated the kind of character and competence that successful businesses are built on. His custom carpentry division has generated 30% more revenue than I projected, largely because customers trust him implicitly." Henderson's testimony established David not as a struggling single father requiring sympathy, but as a successful businessman whose judgment and integrity had been proven through measurable results. The turning point came when Jessica herself took the witness stand for cross-examination. David's attorney approached her with respectful but pointed questions about her decision to leave, her lack of contact during the intervening years, and her current understanding of her daughter's lives and personalities. "Mrs. Thompson," the attorney said, using Jessica's married name, "in your petition, you state that you left due to postpartum depression. But your daughters were 18 months old when you departed. Can you explain the gap between typical postpartum timeframes and your decision to leave?" Jessica's composure wavered slightly. The depression was severe. I wasn't able to think clearly about timeframes or medical definitions. I just knew I wasn't capable of being the mother they deserved." "And during the 8 years since your departure, how many times did you attempt to contact your daughters?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Jessica's attorney objected, but Judge Rodriguez allowed the line of questioning to continue. "I didn't contact them," Jessica said quietly. I convinced myself they were better off without me disrupting their lives." "But now you believe disrupting their lives serves their best interests?" Jessica looked toward the gallery for the first time, her eyes finding Megan and Melissa. Both girls met her gaze with expressions that were neither hostile nor welcoming, simply watchful, waiting to see what this stranger who happened to be their mother would say about their lives. "I thought they would be happier with more opportunities," Jessica said, her voice barely audible. "I thought I could give them things David couldn't." "What things specifically?" "Private schools, travel, cultural experiences, financial security." Are you aware that Megan is currently enrolled in her school's gifted program? That Melissa has a leading role in the community theater's spring production? That both girls are involved in volunteer work at the local library? Jessica blinked, clearly not aware of these details. No, my attorney gathered information about their basic circumstances, but not about their actual lives, David's attorney finished gently. Mrs. Thompson, when did you last have a conversation with either of your daughters? The answer, of course, was never. Jessica had left when the girls were too young for conversation, and had maintained no contact since. She knew nothing about Megan's love of science fiction or Melissa's sense of justice. Nothing about their friendship dynamics or their individual personalities. Nothing about the community they'd grown up in or the life they'd built with their father. The realization seemed to hit Jessica with visible force. She looked again at her daughters, really looked at them, and David saw recognition dawn in her eyes. These weren't the toddlers she'd left behind. These were complex, confident young people with their own opinions, preferences, and attachments. They were strangers to her, and she to them. Your Honor, Jessica said suddenly, interrupting her attorney's objection to the previous question. Could I speak directly to the court? Judge Rodriguez nodded cautiously. Jessica stood, her hands trembling slightly. I came here believing I could offer my daughters a better life. But listening to this testimony, I realize I don't actually know what their life is like. I don't know who they are as people, what makes them happy, what they're afraid of, or what they dream about. I know David. I knew him 8 years ago as a good man who loved them completely. And it sounds like that hasn't changed. She paused, gathering herself. I think I convinced myself that love wasn't enough, that they needed more than what David could provide. But looking at them now, seeing how confident and happy they appear, I'm not sure I was right about that. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Judge Rodriguez leaned forward slightly, recognizing the rare moment when legal proceedings transcended technicalities and touched something fundamentally human. Mrs. Thompson, are you withdrawing your petition? Jessica looked at her attorney, then at her husband, then finally at David. I'd like to request a modification of my petition. Instead of seeking custody, I'd like to ask for supervised visitation rights. I want to get to know my daughters, if they're willing. But I don't want to disrupt the life they've built. The legal resolution that followed was swift and decisive. Judge Rodriguez granted David continued primary custody, formalized Edith's grandparental rights, and established a visitation schedule that would allow Jessica to gradually build relationships with Megan and Melissa if all parties agreed. But the real transformation was happening outside the legal framework. As court adjourned and the gallery emptied, David found himself face to face with Jessica for the first time in 8 years. Thank you, he said simply. Jessica nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry. For leaving, for not staying in touch, for trying to take them away from the only home they've really known. I'm so sorry. They're good kids, David said. If you want to know them, really know them, they're worth the effort. I can see that. I'd like to try, if they want to. Megan approached them with characteristic directness. We can start slow, she said to Jessica. Maybe letters first? I like writing letters. Melissa was more cautious but not unkind. We'll see how it goes, she said, the same phrase she used for trying new foods or considering new friendships. 6 months later, David signed the partnership papers that made him co-owner of Henderson Hardware and Custom Carpentry. The business was thriving, with a 6-month waiting list for custom projects and plans to expand into 3 counties. Edith had stepped back from active management of her company to focus on what she called quality of life investments, time with her granddaughters, support for David's business growth, and the discovery of interests she'd ignored for decades. Jessica visited every other weekend, building relationships with her daughters through shared activities and gradual trust. The process was awkward sometimes, but it was honest. And Megan and Melissa were learning that families could be complicated without being broken. The transformation was complete, but more importantly, it was sustainable. They built something together that could weather challenges because it was rooted in genuine love, mutual respect, and the daily choice to show up for each other. They'd become family in the truest sense, not by accident of birth, but by deliberate commitment to each other's well-being. 3 years later, on a crisp October morning, David Moore stood in the workshop behind Henderson Hardware and Custom Carpentry, teaching a group of teenagers how to properly measure and cut dovetail joints. The workshop had grown from a single garage space to a 3,000 square foot facility that served as both business headquarters and community education center. What had started as David's personal woodworking operation had evolved into something much larger, a place where craftsmanship, mentorship, and second chances intersected in ways that were transforming lives throughout Millfield. The key to a strong joint, David explained to his students, isn't forcing the pieces together. It's taking the time to make sure they're cut precisely enough to fit naturally. The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone present. David had become known throughout the region, not just for his exceptional carpentry, but for his ability to see potential in young people who'd been written off by other programs. The workshop employed 6 full-time craftspeople, offered apprenticeships to high school students, and provided free woodworking classes to anyone in the community who wanted to learn. 11-year-old Megan moved between the workstations with the confidence of someone who'd grown up around tools and sawdust. She was documenting the apprenticeship program for a school project on community development. But more than that, she was preparing for her own future involvement in what had become a family enterprise. Her gift for analysis had evolved into a passion for understanding how systems worked and how they could be improved. "Dad," she said, approaching David with her notebook open, "Mrs. Richardson from the county office wants to know if we'd be interested in expanding the youth program. They're talking about funding for job training programs in 3 other towns." David smiled at his daughter's businesslike tone. Megan had inherited both her father's practical nature and her grandmother's strategic thinking, though she expressed both qualities with a diplomatic skill that impressed adults twice her age. Melissa, meanwhile, was across town at Jefferson Elementary, leading a creative writing workshop for younger students. At 11, she'd already established herself as a mentor and advocate, channeling her natural intensity into programs that helped other kids find their voices. The community theater had created a youth leadership position specifically for her, recognizing her ability to inspire confidence in performers while maintaining the discipline necessary for successful productions. The girls' development had become a source of pride and wonder for everyone who knew them. They'd grown into young people who understood both privilege and responsibility, who appreciated security without taking it for granted, and who saw helping others not as obligation, but as natural expression of the values they'd absorbed from watching their father navigate impossible circumstances with Grace. Edith arrived at the workshop that morning carrying coffee and pastries from Romano's Bakery, another business that had flourished partly through connections fostered by the extended Moore family network. At 68, she moved with the energy of someone who'd discovered purpose that went beyond profit margins and quarterly reports. Her transformation from corporate executive to engaged grandmother and community investor had surprised everyone, including herself. "The Peterson family called," she told David, settling into the chair she'd claimed as her own in the workshop's small office. "Their oldest son is interested in the apprenticeship program, but they're worried about the time commitment interfering with his part-time job." "Same conversation we had with the Martinez family last month," David replied. "What did you tell them?" "That we'd figure out a schedule that works. The Hendersons have offered flexible hours for apprentices who need to maintain other employment, and the community college is willing to arrange their technical courses around work schedules. This was how problems got solved and they're expanding." circle of influence through networks of people who'd learned to see individual challenges as opportunities for collaborative solutions. David's business success had given him credibility and resources, but more importantly, it had created a platform for addressing systemic issues that affected working families throughout the region. The Moore Family Foundation, established quietly, with Edith's guidance and funding, had become a significant force for educational and economic development in Central Oregon. But unlike traditional charity models, their approach focused on creating sustainable opportunities rather than temporary assistance. The apprenticeship program, the community workshops, the small business development loans, all were designed to help people build capacity rather than simply address immediate needs. Jessica's integration into this expanded family structure had been gradual but genuine. Her visits had evolved from awkward reunification attempts into natural participation in family activities and community events. She'd moved closer to Millfield the previous year, accepting a position with the regional school district that allowed her to use her education credentials while maintaining regular contact with Megan and Melissa. "She's different now," Melissa had observed about her mother during one of their family dinners. "Less scared, I think. Like she finally figured out that being our mom doesn't mean she has to be perfect." The comment had surprised everyone with its insight, but it captured something important about the family dynamics they'd all learned to navigate. Jessica's relationship with her daughters was different from David's, less central, more supplementary, but it was authentic in ways that forced abandonment hadn't allowed. The girls had learned they could love their mother while maintaining primary loyalty to their father, and Jessica had learned that being a parent could take many forms beyond traditional custody arrangements. The ripple effects of their story had spread throughout Millfield in ways none of them had anticipated. The courthouse proceedings had attracted regional media attention, not because of legal drama but because of the community mobilization it had revealed. Journalists had been fascinated by the idea of an entire town rallying around a single father's custody fight, and their coverage had highlighted Millfield as a model of what rural communities could accomplish through collaborative support systems. Tourism had increased as people came to see the town that had defended one of its own so effectively. Small businesses had benefited from the attention, and several families had relocated to Millfield, specifically because they wanted to raise children in a community with such strong values. But the most significant long-term impact was harder to quantify. The way their experience had changed how people in Millfield thought about family, support, and community responsibility. The successful defense of David's custody had established precedents that made it easier for other single parents to access resources and advocacy. The business partnerships that had emerged during the crisis had evolved into permanent collaborative networks. The mentorship relationships that had begun during the court proceedings had become institutional programs. "You know what I think about sometimes?" David said to Edith as they watched the afternoon apprentices arrive for their shift. "What would have happened if you hadn't taken that job at Evans and Associates? If we'd never met?" Edith considered the question seriously, as she did most inquiries that touched on fate versus choice. "I think you would have found another way," she said finally. "You were always going to succeed as a father because you never stopped prioritizing what mattered most. I was fortunate to be able to help, but you were doing the important work long before I appeared. But the girls wouldn't have known they had a grandmother. You wouldn't have had the chance to be part of their lives." "That's true," Edith acknowledged. "And that would have been a loss for all of us. But David, the most important thing wasn't my presence, it was the love you'd already built with them. Everything else was just enhancement." As evening approached, the workshop settled into its closing routine. Apprentices cleaned their work areas and secured projects in progress. Community class participants gathered their tools and shared progress updates. David locked the main facility while Edith organized the next day's schedule. Megan and Melissa arrived as they did most evenings, having finished homework at their grandmother's office before walking the 3 blocks to meet their father. The 4 of them drove home together, continuing conversations about school projects, weekend plans, and the small details that comprise their shared daily life. Their story had become part of Millfield's identity, but more importantly, it had become a template that other families and communities could adapt to their own circumstances. The fundamental lessons that consistent love creates stability, that communities are stronger when they support vulnerable members, that second chances can benefit everyone involved, were transferable to any context where people chose to prioritize human connection over individual advancement. "I want to tell you something," David said to his family as they prepared dinner that evening. "I've been thinking about how to explain what the past few years have meant, and I keep coming back to something simple. You taught me that the best life isn't the one where you avoid difficulties, it's the one where you face difficulties with people who won't let you face them alone." Megan nodded thoughtfully. "Like how problems get smaller when more people help solve them, and how helping other people solve their problems makes you stronger," Melissa added. Edith smiled at her granddaughter's synthesis of complex ideas into practical wisdom. "That's exactly right. And that's why your story matters to other people, because it shows that ordinary families can create extraordinary outcomes when they're supported by communities that understand what really matters." Their story continued to unfold, no longer marked by crisis and uncertainty, but by the steady accumulation of positive impact and deepening relationships. They'd learned that the most powerful transformations happen not through dramatic interventions, but through consistent choices to show up for each other, day after day, with whatever resources and energy they could offer. If this story has touched something in you, consider how your own community might benefit from the kind of intentional support and collaborative problem-solving that transform the Moore family circumstances. Look around you for single parents who could use practical assistance, young people who could benefit from mentorship, elderly neighbors who might appreciate connection, or local businesses that strengthen community resilience. The most important changes often begin with simple recognition that we're all interconnected, and that small acts of kindness, sustained over time, can create possibilities none of us could achieve alone. From our hearts to yours, thank you for spending this time with us. Keep believing in the power of showing up. You never know which moment of consistency might change everything. 10 years after that certified letter had threatened to tear their family apart, David Moore stood in the auditorium of Millfield Community College, watching his daughter Megan deliver the valedictorian speech to the graduating class of 2035. At 18, she possessed the same analytical intelligence that had helped her navigate family crisis at 8, but now it was paired with a confidence that came from years of being heard, supported, and challenged to grow. "The most important lesson I've learned," Megan told her classmates, "is that strength isn't about facing challenges alone. It's about building relationships strong enough to face challenges together." In the audience, Melissa applauded enthusiastically between her parents, having driven up from Los Angeles where she was completing her sophomore year at UCLS School of Theater, Film and Television. Her acceptance into one of the nation's most competitive programs had surprised no one who'd watched her develop leadership skills through years of community theater in Millfield. She'd chosen to stay connected to her hometown through a scholarship fund she'd established for rural students pursuing arts education. Edith, now 75 and officially retired, but more active than ever, had tears streaming down her face as she watched her granddaughter speak. The Evans Family Foundation had grown into a regional powerhouse for educational and economic development, but Edith's proudest accomplishment remained the simple fact that she'd learned to be present for the people she loved most. Jessica sat 2 rows behind them with her husband and their 4-year-old son, David's half-brother whom Megan and Melissa adored without reservation. Her journey back into her daughter's lives had been slow and sometimes difficult, but it had taught all of them that family could expand and evolve in ways that honored the past while creating space for new love. Workshop behind Henderson. Hardware had become more community arts and trade center, employing 23 people and operating satellite programs in 6 counties. David's approach to combining craftsmanship education with life skills. Mentoring had been adopted by vocational programs throughout the Pacific Northwest, and he'd been invited to speak at conferences about sustainable community development. But on this particular evening, as his family gathered for dinner at Romano's to celebrate Megan's graduation, David's greatest satisfaction came from the simplest observation. His daughters had grown into young women who understood their own worth, who approached challenges with creativity and collaboration, and who saw helping others as natural expression of the abundance they'd received. The story that had begun with a desperate father working 3 jobs to feed his twin daughters had evolved into a legacy of community engagement, educational innovation, and proof that the most powerful transformations happen when people choose to invest in each other's success. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness really do echo across decades, creating ripples that touch lives in ways we never imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.